Right? Where'd you go? Here, let's get a drink, and it's time for this little one to take a nap. Come on.
Welcome everyone to the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference. This is Colleen McCarthy O'Toole from CureSMA's Family Support Department. We thank you all so much for joining us today for the Navigating Special Education Process, Setting Up Our Children for Preschool and Elementary School. We are so grateful to our national presenting sponsors, Biogen, Genentech, and Novartis Gene Therapies for their incredible support of this year's Virtual SMA Conference. We greatly encourage your interaction and live questions for this session. If you have any questions, you can use the raise hand button or the Zoom chat located in your toolbar. You can also ask live questions during the sessions. We will address questions that come throughout the session. We would now like to introduce our speakers, Tina Lewis and Kimberly Cook. Tina and Kimberly.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. Thanks for joining us. I am Tina Lewis. I am the parent of a teenager with SMA, and I'm also a reading support teacher, educator for the past 20 plus years. Kimberly, you need to unmute.
Thank you, Tina. My name is Kimberly Cook. I'm an inclusion specialist, and I also have an adult son with SMA type 2. Next slide.
So first, we're going to talk about some disclaimers, just to make sure that everyone knows that there are certain things as we, based on our own experience with our children with SMA, are based on, I'm from Maryland. So much of what I share today is based on my own experience in Maryland, and there are some variations in the state and local level laws, but there are also some federal laws that are common for all of the states.
And I am from Texas, and the federal laws are interpreted differently in Texas, or uniquely, I guess. We call our IEP meetings, which you'll hear us talk about, we call them ARD meetings, admission, review, and dismissal. So that's a difference.
Next slide. So this is my sweet son, his first day on and going into kindergarten. And the one disclaimer that I feel is important to share, we make decisions for our children based on their own individual physical, social, emotional, cognitive needs. And my hope today is that based on what I share with you, what I've experienced for the past 14 years will benefit your own decision-making for your individual child. Next slide. The other thing that I think is important to highlight is I will speak to, my son has been in multiple settings throughout his educational career. And as you know, our children have to, it's very important that they're navigating the educational setting with ease. And so the setting oftentimes dictates a lot of the decisions that we're making. And we could also feel the difference in the setting for the past year in the virtual setting. Which also needs to be accessible for our students. Next slide.
The first thing we want to talk about is the fact that our children, because they have disabilities, are eligible for services from birth to 3 years old. And often these are called early intervention classes. In Texas, it's called early childhood intervention. But any infant or toddler with developmental delays are eligible for services and supports. These services can occur in your home or in a community setting. My child had his services in a community setting for several hours a day, which enabled me to continue working, which was nice. And specialists work with children and their families on all sorts of things: physical skills, cognitive, communication, self-help, and social and emotional skills. Next slide. Early intervention is offered in all states, but every state is going to be doing it differently. It looks different in Texas than it does for Tina in Maryland. And the referring process is different for children in different states also. Often a parent can refer their child, or in some states, a healthcare provider or childcare provider has to make the referral for an evaluation. And if the child's found eligible, then the early childhood program will work with the family to develop what's called an individualized family service plan. And this plan outlines the goals and services the child will receive. Next slide. Okay, and eligibility is a developmental delay, or what often helps our children become eligible is a specific health condition that will probably lead to a delay. So I think SMA would qualify in that area. Next slide.
So I can speak to the program and my own experience through my son's experience. We have a program here in Maryland. It's called the Infants and Toddlers program. And Julian, when he was at the age of about 2.5, we started to notice that developmentally he wasn't doing things that other children his age were doing. I'll never forget a moment in time. I took him to a place called My Gym, and he was on the trampoline and he was jumping on his knees compared to all of the other 2.5-year-olds jumping on their feet. And I finally had a preschool teacher, because he was at an in-home preschool teacher at that point, say she was concerned that he did need assistance going up and down the stairs. So that led to me seeking for support. So I initially called what was referred to as the Infants and Toddlers program, and their goal was really to enable and support me and enable him to actually be able to function in multiple settings as a young child. So it was twofold. It was supporting me and my husband, and it was also supporting Julian and what kinds of services we could put into place for him. This was prior to being diagnosed. So we started to notice at the time that there were delays in his development. And then about 6 months later, he was actually diagnosed from a medical professional. That referral, as I had shared, just my own anecdotes of watching him compared to others developmentally, he was my first child. I didn't know any differently. Physicians had told us everything's fine. He's just delayed, until we finally got the diagnosis from Dr. Thomas Crawford. So a referral can be made, and really what led to going to Infants and Toddlers program was the preschool teacher coming and saying to me, in 25 years, I have not seen a child unable to walk down the steps. And that first step was, okay, I need somebody in-house to help me, which eventually led to the medical diagnosis.
And Tina, that's interesting. That brings me back to Spencer's referral. It was his childcare provider that said something's wrong, because Spencer was my first child too. I didn't realize he should be bearing weight on his legs.
Yes, it was interesting, Kimberly, because I would pull up to pick my son up each day from this in-house preschool, and each day when I was picking Julian up, his preschool teacher was helping him down the steps.
Oh.
And the first few times I was like, that's interesting. But it was all those anecdotes that you start to notice as a parent of a child with SMA.
And they accumulate.
Yeah. So two of the highlights I can say that were beneficial to me is if you look at that first image on the left, what was really beneficial to me as a mom who really had never experienced anything like this was having an adult come into the home and talk to me about resources that were available, and actually help me seek out resources. That was really, really helpful, because I felt alone, scared, and going through that process of not having any answers on paper was just terrifying. And so I really enjoyed having that camaraderie with another professional who really knows our local resources. The other thing that I think was a real benefit at that point in time was that Julian was actually, through the infants and toddlers program, he started experiencing his homeschool that he would go to as a kindergartner. So he would actually have physical therapy with someone working through the state, but also working with the local schools, who we would meet each week, and he would go into that school setting. And I really do believe that that was beneficial as he transitioned into kindergarten. Next.
And one of the benefits I found was a relationship between me and his providers. They were very supportive to me emotionally, as well as for resources.
I completely agree.
And so when we talk about special education and all the services we're talking about today, a lot of it is based on federal requirements. Next slide. And one thing you'll hear a lot about is idea that Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that was passed in 1990, and it requires our schools to include and educate students with special needs, and each child that's eligible will have a specialized academic plan developed for them, and we traditionally call those IEPs. Next slide. The very first step in determining eligibility for services is to determine if the child has a disability. Next slide. And there are 13 different categories a child can become eligible in. Traditionally, our kids are deemed eligible under orthopedic impairment or other health impairment. And honestly, the eligibility title does not matter. Your child still will receive individual services based on his need, not on his eligibility category. Next slide. And when we talk about limited health impairment, we talk about limited strength, vitality, and respect. And I want to say, in respect to the educational environment, he has to show limited strength, vitality with respect to where he is in the instructional setting. Next slide.
So I just want to add in the process that we're talking about right now really did not start for Julian until just prior to kindergarten. So I would want to say he was probably 4.5, and these steps started to take place. And the next step in this process was, is there an educational need? So as a mom of a child who's a kindergartner with SMA, preparing to go into school, this was huge for me, because cognitively my son was not affected. And I really, being an educator, knew personally, you do have a choice, that I wanted my son to have an IEP. And we really had to advocate for, he cannot navigate the educational setting at the same pace that his peers can. And so that was a little bit tricky for a child who really is not cognitively impacted. Next slide. So what is an IEP? We hear the acronym all of the time. It was not a unique acronym to me. I knew exactly what it was as an educator, but basically it is a contract. It's a contract between you as the family and the school. And it is a federal requirement that our children will be in the least restrictive environment. They will not be and should not be in a separate classroom because, for example, my son at that point in time was using a wheelchair for longer distances. He should not be in a separate classroom because he has a wheelchair. He really needed to be in and was placed in the classroom with his peers. So least restrictive environment is critical for our children. It describes in this contract, it describes our children's disability. So it identifies that disability, the present level of performance, which is connected to really to the assessments that they're doing, the educational services that will be provided to ensure success in the setting, the school placement, and then measurable goals and objectives. And I just want to highlight, this is where you really come in as the family. You're going to hear us talk repeatedly about how important it is for us to be at the table. And you'll also hear us say how important it is to educate the educators. And this is where, when we're talking about goals and objectives, this is where the family and your knowledge base about what is best for your child will be important to bring into this contract. Next slide. So identifying an educational need. And as I said before, this was probably the biggest hurdle for me and my husband to cross. So assessments are required in all areas of the suspected disability. So they will do, at the age of 4.5, is he prepared for kindergarten? They do a whole range of assessments. Assessments are required because they need to find that educational need. If they don't suspect a need, but you do, put a request in writing. So Kimberly and I have done multiple sessions together, and we will mention we made mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes I made was going into kindergarten. I knew that my son needed speech and language therapy to a degree, very minor anecdotes that I observed. They disagreed. And by the time he was in 3rd grade, he was receiving, for about 2 years, he did receive speech services. Requesting evaluations. If you have a request as a parent, let's say your child starts kindergarten and they don't have an IEP going into kindergarten, and you suspect over time there could be an educational need, you can submit a request. The child's teacher can submit a request, school psychologist, or even the principal. But please know that you can as well. Next slide.
You can submit that request to the principal, the teacher, the special educator, anyone in the school should take your request.
Yeah. So the timeline is critical. I share this with families all the time. So the district has 30 to 60 school days, vary somewhat depending on the state, from the date of your approval to complete the evaluation. And I underline school days because we've had some students who've come to the table March, April, and because they end that school year, maybe less than the 60-day timeline, they come into the following year in that grade level, still under evaluation. So it's really critical that as parents, that you just monitor that timeline. So if you suspect a disability or a need in September, October of kindergarten, then I would definitely submit your request as soon as possible. And I might just add this little anecdote that right now, given the circumstances of the pandemic, this timeline is critical. We just have a lot of students out there who need this evaluation, and there's quite a long wait list. Once you receive a copy of the IEP or the results of the evaluation, please make sure you take the time to read it thoroughly before your IEP meeting, or reach out to a friend, Kimberly, myself, and have us dissect some of the language in the IEPs. It can be daunting unless you're an educator. They use a lot of acronyms and language that sometimes is just not family friendly. And don't sign anything until you go to the IEP table, because your knowledge base about your child and their needs is really critical. And it's important to share that knowledge when you're there at the table with the team. If you don't receive a copy of the evaluation and the test and results, you can definitely request it and receive that in hand before the meeting. Reevaluation for children is every 3 years, which means by law, every 3 years, you're coming back to the table to do a complete review of the IEP. I will say, though, there have been multiple times prior to treatment that Julian's needs had changed. So we could not wait it would have been a detriment to wait the 3 years. So oftentimes we would put in a request and say, through his case manager, we would like to actually come to the table sooner than the 3 years. His needs have shifted and we need to put new things in place to set him up for success. Next slide.
So the IEP process includes 3 separate steps. One is finding the need, the educational need is identified, the goals are created within the areas of need, and then services are provided in the areas of need. Next slide. So when you're developing an IEP, you have to look at the present levels of performance, where the child is at the time their IEP is written. And the IEP has to address the student's unique needs, what is special to that child. And any child with SMA or any other disability will have differing needs. No IEP should look like another because they are individualized. We talk about free, appropriate public education. So any services that your school or that has been put into your IEP will be free to you. Transportation, OT, PT, any services that you as a group have decided are important for your child will be provided to you at no charge. The IEP includes goals and objectives, and the purpose of those is to measure progress. We want to know where your child is at the beginning of the school year and at the end, and that monitoring should go on during the entire school year and be reported to you on a regular basis. We talk about accommodations and modifications, and these are weird to me. These are tricky definitions. Modifications usually mean that the child is not doing all of the coursework or is not expected to master all of the coursework. So typically our children with SMA who do not have cognitive delays will receive what we call accommodations. And that just means extended time, maybe a special chair with raised sides so the child is more secure in his seating. It might require assistive technology, anything to help him meet the demands of the school day and to learn the content he's required to learn for his grade level. And then we also talk about the least restrictive environment. The child should always be in a setting that is the least restrictive. And Tina, in my opinion, all children should be with SMA should be in a typical classroom with their typically developing peers. I have never seen a reason why a child with SMA should be in a setting that is separate from his peers. So if anybody has questions about that, we would be happy to talk to you. Next slide. Okay, the key to the goals is the goals must be measurable. So this is an example of a goal. Julian will improve physical fitness and physical education in the area of upper body, muscular strength and endurance, increasing to 10 wheelchair push-ups. So 10 is a concrete number. So you would have, school would need to collect data to show where he is at the beginning before he starts with this goal. So maybe he can do 2. Oh, you guys, I'm so sorry. My dog is barking. And the next slide.
And can I just speak to that just quickly? You know, there's, you know, when that goal was established, this is where your knowledge base as a family and knowing your child and SMA, when that goal was established, really, this was prior to any treatments for SMA, and strengthening in the school, that was not at the top of our priority list for Julian. So now, even in hindsight, looking back at that goal, I'm like, wow, that wasn't really a great goal, because we would have really rather him focused on navigating his setting and not necessarily working on strengthening. Now with his treatment, I would definitely continue to focus on strengthening, but it's just something to note.
Next slide.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the IEP meeting. having sat in these myself as an educator for years, I want to say 10 years prior to having my son, and then going in and sitting on the other side of the table was a drastically different experience for me. I went in feeling quite confident and ready. And then I walked into a room, next slide, that looks like the image on the left. It was daunting because now we're not talking about one of the students I teach, we're talking about my child, and I'm his mom. And he is, for the first time ever, stepping into a building where he will spend most of his time with this group of adults instead of me. So that initial IEP meeting was quite overwhelming, but I did it. And now I can tell you with all great respect, the advocacy that I did at that table for my son was worth every minute. Now, just so that you know, IEP meetings are still being held. They are being held virtually. So you should still have IEP meetings. The evaluative process that we talked about earlier when identifying an educational need is the harder part, because it's just great to have students sitting right next to you when you assess them. Next slide. Who must be at the table? So really, these are the professionals you should see around this table. You should see your special educator. Oftentimes, I know in Maryland, we call them the case manager, a district representative or administrator, the evaluator, the person who actually assessed your child. So you might have, if your child was assessed for OT, PT, speech and language, academic needs. We had someone who actually came into one meeting who just watched Julian for a day navigate his entire setting. That's when we were actually trying to determine if he needed a one-on-one assistant. General educator. So you need to have at least one general educator there, one classroom teacher if your child happens to go to multiple teachers. And of course, the family members are invited. The one thing I can tell you, I hear oftentimes, is that there is not a district representative or an administrator in the building. You want an administrator in the building. So you have the right, you want an administrator in the meeting. You have the right to request that an administrator is present if you don't see him or her. If there's a chance that a team member is not going to be available for the meeting, you would have to sign off that it's okay that that person is not there. I have had several instances that a district representative, so we have a special educator, but we also have a director of special ed. As I shared earlier, Julian's been in multiple settings, and she was fantastic. So she was the director of the program and would actually come to some of the IEP meetings, and still a dear friend of mine. So you have the right to ask a person at the district level to attend as well. Next slide. Who could be at the table? Julian attended his first IEP meeting in 8th grade. So that was a unique transition for me. Powerful to have him there voicing his own wants and needs. A school psychologist, adaptive PE teacher. We had an adaptive PE teacher at every meeting, just because that was a huge part of Julian's academic career and until he no longer had to take PE. Speech language pathologist, OT, PT, and you might also have an advocate friend or family member there. It's like going to a very important doctor's visit, and you're going to be receiving information, and a lot of information, and sometimes it's just a lot to digest. It's always nice to have another set of ears in the room with you. Next,
you know what? I'd like to add that my son Spencer attended his IEP meetings from, I want to say, kindergarten. I always had him participate. I mean, he didn't participate when he was younger as much as just watch me advocate for him. And I thought that was an important skill for him to learn and to know we were always behind him, and that he had a group of people to support him. And he could see all those people around the table.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk for a minute about school-based OT and PT. Next slide. Okay, a lot of times I hear parents are expecting the school-based OT and PT to replace their medical-based OT and PT, what they're doing through their family, and that is not the case. OT and PT, school-based therapy, is based on the educational needs. The priority is to establish a safe and effective way for our children to participate in educational activities and routines in natural environments. And when we talk about natural environments, we're talking about hallways, classrooms, PE, the bathroom, and that's really where these therapies should occur. When we talk about least restrictive environment, that means in the school setting, in the classroom. So I like to not see our children pulled out of those natural settings for therapy, because the therapy is going to be better if your therapist can see where your child's having difficulty in those natural environments. Are they having trouble getting their books out of the locker or opening their laptop in class? Those are the kinds of things that should be addressed in school-based therapies. Next
I have
slide.
an example, Kimberly. I spoke to the physical therapist who would actually go into the school setting with Julian just prior to kindergarten. And we actually went into the lunchroom and she supported him and gave him different techniques to help him transfer from his chair to the lunch table, because we really wanted him to sit with friends
Right.
at the lunch table. And so part of her expertise came in as, okay, so how can he safely transfer from his chair to the lunch table? But it was all about just navigating the educational space.
And I think those natural environments are so important for the therapist, because he can see the options in that environment that might benefit the student.
Yeah, absolutely. And even after that visit, we determined like the placement of the cafeteria table where he would actually sit. We wanted his location to actually be close to getting in line so he wouldn't have to carry the tray so far. And yeah, it was great.
Next slide.
So one of the things that really came to the surface for me, and just the reality of where we are in today's world is, we all know and we're quite comfortable with the fire drill. As an educator now, I can tell you we probably have eight different drills that we do and we practice for. And what really needs to be in the emergency plan for our children is what is going to happen for each type of drill. Because what may occur for a lockdown, I can tell you that for my son, and at the elementary age, he definitely would not have been able to climb under a desk and put his hands over his head and stay under the desk. So what is the alternative for him to ensure safety? So schools are very, very equipped with, this is what we're going to do during the fire drill, but there needs to be a plan for each type of drill written into
and a designated person to be responsible for that.
Exactly.
Key.
Yeah, I think there was one instance where Julian actually came out of the building, and at this point he was using a wheelchair full time, and the exit that they left the building out of didn't have a ramp to get down. Oh. Yeah, so also ensuring that they practice with our children in mind.
Right.
Next slide.
Okay, we've talked about special education services, but let's talk for a minute about 504 plans. Next slide. Some of our children are eligible under special education for services, but 504 is also an option. It doesn't give the parents as many rights as far as due process, but 504 is a civil rights law, and it just prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. and it ensures that a child with a disability will have equal access to an education. 504 is also the law that will follow our children into the workplace and into college, because special education will end at graduation. Next slide. 504 in the public school will have paperwork. It's usually less dense than an IEP, but it will include accommodations. And they could include anything like more time between classes. It can include occupational and physical therapy. It often doesn't. That usually comes under IEP, but different schools handle things in different way, and it could include these therapies. It could include a peer helper, oral testing, note-taking assistance, anything that would help your child have equal access to education, and not just education, but the school environment physically and socially as well. Next slide.
So this is my son. I think you saw the picture earlier. This is Julian, first day of kindergarten. Very, very exciting day for him and very nervous day for me. This is Julian now. On the right side there, you can see him. He's 17 years old now. And that's my daughter, Sienna, who was born just 3 years after he was. She is a carrier, but not affected by SMA. Julian walked until he was in 3rd grade. He was diagnosed with type 3 SMA. Unfortunately, he had a couple of fractures back to back that led to quick atrophy of his muscles, and now he uses a wheelchair full time. But it has not stopped him, and it has just really, really increased my need to advocate for our children. Next slide. So when I think about my own journey as a mom, and if there were one picture to capture my journey of a child with SMA and the accessibility of our world, this would probably be the one. So I'm going to kind of go through each image. That image that you see on the left, we hear the word all of the time, and it's equality. And when I hear the word equality, it really just burns my ears. Equality is about everyone getting the same thing, right? So you can see there, you know, the 3 children are getting the exact same thing. There's no difference. It's equal. It's fair, equal conditions. If you look in the middle, equity is a term that we really use in the educational platform right now. And this is about everyone getting what they need to be successful. So I would find, as a mom going into the educational setting with a child who has a physical disability, I have kept equity at the forefront of my mind. It has eliminated some barriers. It has been the premise of my fight or my advocacy. I can tell you there have been instances, multiple instances, where I've had a professional say to me, well, we are completely ADA compliant. And the minute that I talk about equity and access, things change. And then, of course, our ultimate goal is on the far right, which is liberation. And that is actually eliminating the barrier. It shouldn't be there in the first place. So I can give you an example. Liberation, my son just started a job last Friday, and we go to this big office building, and there are 2 12-foot glass doors, really thick glass with 2 big silver handles on those doors. And I thought to myself, he can't get in that building on his own. While I'm excited that he has an internship, he can't get in without my help in opening the doors. So liberation would be, let's add a button onto the doors or just eliminate the doors. Next slide. Okay, starting preschool. So we're going to actually start to get into just some of the things that if you were to have Julian's IEP in hand, these are some of the things that you would actually see. Next slide.
Okay, by law, any 3 to 5-year-old with a documented disability is entitled to a preschool education. So you can come from an early childhood program into a 3 to 5-year-old program. And this is special education in a public school. This is when your IEP starts, as Tina had talked about. And your child could be eligible for services like speech, OT, physical therapy, and transportation services. If your child has a disability, the school is responsible for getting your child to school to access those services. Your school will evaluate your child at no cost to you, and they will determine whether your child has what they call a handicapping condition. We mentioned before, you just have to contact your school, and it's best if you do it in writing, and it's best if you contact the special education department requesting an evaluation, but you can make the request to your teacher or principal as well. Next slide. And I want to talk a minute about instructional settings, and this is critical to me because in Texas, we call this a preschool program for children with disabilities. PPCD is what they call it. And typically schools think that is a place where services are given to your child to support your child and prepare him for elementary school. But it's not, the preschool program is not a place. A preschool program should be services so that your child is included with children who do not have disabilities. It's best if your child participates in a typical preschool program and receives services in that setting. Because we really want our children to interact with typically developing peers, just like everyone else. Next slide.
So I included an image there of a very, very tall flight of stairs. So my son's, one of his first preschool experiences outside of the home that you see there on the right was at a local preschool, a private preschool, prior to kindergarten. And, I was very nervous. And so, as I shared earlier, Kimberly and we've made mistakes and we've learned from them. So I happened to be able to go there for Julian once a month, would actually go up this huge flight of stairs for a chapel experience once a month. And I will say to you that he didn't always communicate to me when things were difficult. And so I go for a celebration at the school, and it's one of these instances where we walk up this flight of steps to go into this chapel experience. Anyway, immediately I thought, there has to be an elevator in this building. And I started to talk to the teachers about conservation of energy and how while he can walk up the steps, by the time he gets to this flight, and I'm not kidding you, it really probably looked about this height. By the time he got to the top, he wasn't able to enjoy being with his peers. And it turns out there was an elevator in the building. It turns out that the teacher felt claustrophobic, so she didn't feel comfortable riding up in the elevator. And so what should I have done as a parent prior to sending my child to any setting is tour the building. And so I learned that from the experience. He was 3 years old at the time, only going a couple of days a week. And well, I was very upset. Needless to say, I returned, and there you can see him on the right-hand side to the setting in the home, which he had just a fantastic experience with that teacher. But touring the building early and understanding how our children navigate it. As he got older, we would tour first with him, and then we would go back as parents and tour and share his own feelings about the tour and what he thought would be best for him. Next slide. And then we transitioned into elementary school. And as I shared earlier, we definitely had an IEP. That was something that my husband and I felt passionate about. Next slide. So a lot of information on this slide, but I'm just going to run through a couple of things that we did to really set him up for success. A spring meeting prior to the start of kindergarten, which I mentioned earlier. Recess was most definitely not my favorite part of the day for him. we had to really advocate for alternatives for play, game boards, figures, cars, trucks. It is not an option for Julian to go into the office, and I've heard this happen to some of our other children with SMA. They're not going into the office to sit in a room to sit by themselves. They need to have someone out there who can monitor any falls if your child's ambulatory, or help them enjoy play with peers. Julian, like I said, in early elementary, always had access to a chair outside of the classroom for longer distances because we wanted him to conserve his energy for PE. For example, he had a chair. Oftentimes in the early elementary ages, children are coming onto the carpet and they're sitting around the floor during a great read aloud. So he had the option to sit in a chair. If I were to go back, everyone would have had an option to sit in a chair so that he didn't really stand out, because most of the time he just wanted to be on the floor with his friends. Pre-cut materials, our children should not be cutting materials on their own. They should be pre-cut so that they can actually produce what everyone else is producing, because I can tell you for Julian in kindergarten, it would have taken him longer just to cut everything to get to the point of creating something. I lifted him up the steps to get onto the bus to avoid fatigue. He had a styrofoam tray at lunch. It was just easier to carry, a lot less lighter. And again, this is at the point where there weren't any treatments for SMA. So he really had much more limited strength then than he does now. Next slide. Adaptive technology, I will tell you, until everyone around him had an iPad, which wasn't until high school, he really did not want to use his iPad. So we had to come up with some alternatives. He really did not want to look any more different than he already did compared to his peers. I mentioned the wheelchair for longer travel times. He always had an extra set of books at home. Kimberly can speak to Bookshare, daily opportunities for movement. So once he started to use a wheelchair full-time in 3rd grade, we put things in his IEP that ensured he had the opportunity to get out of his chair. He received extended time on all assessments, and I can tell you that is huge for our children, and he still has that in high school. Preferential seating, preferential chaperones. I was told in kindergarten that I could no longer chaperone. So we actually put that in the IEP the following school year, and a scribe for longer writing tasks. You'll especially see that in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. Our Julian was able to write maybe a few sentences, whereas some typical 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders are writing paragraphs. And then he did have OT and PT services until being in the classroom with peers really took priority for him. Next slide. And let me add, we do have medical physical therapy services. So we have maintained that. It's all about equitable opportunities. So you can see, as I shared earlier in the left image, he's there on the floor with his peers. It was laborious. It was hard for him, but that was important to him. You can see Scarlett on the right side. She's actually eye to eye playing a game with peers. The school system has provided standards in the classroom, so they can provide equipment if it ensures the least restrictive environment for your child. Next slide. Equitable opportunities to play. As I told you, recess was just, it was a battle that I continuously had to fight. And so you can see here, we actually, through a charitable donation, added equipment on the playground that he could engage with as well. The mulch was not ideal, but we had to pick and choose our battles. You can see him on the left-hand side there, just being a part of, we had something in Maryland called Field Day, which is a huge big deal to elementary students. Next slide. And let me just say too, with Field Day, we really had to advocate to make sure that all of the activities included in Field Day were accessible to Julian and he could engage in. So there shouldn't be an activity there that he can't be a part of. Field trips, we eventually had, like I said, my husband or myself were always chaperones for safety reasons. That was critical for us. We would even, the teachers would place him in groups with friends. You can see on the left side there, he's with a group of buddies for the field trip. And a great story on the right-hand side, you can see that that table, we went out to the playground and there wasn't a whole lot for Julian to do. So his fourth grade class raised enough money to purchase a table that he could roll right up to, and they could play board games, checkers, and sit eye to eye with peers. Next slide. So this is, I spoke earlier about just equitable access. I did a tour of, this was his second elementary school that he went to. I did a tour of the field, and the lovely gentleman who went on the tour with me said, it's completely ADA compliant. You shouldn't have any issues. And my one question was, it's hard to see in the image, but there is a gully there. You can almost see a bridge. And there's no way Julian's wheelchair would have gotten through that. And I said, well, how's he going to actually be able to get out there and play ball with friends? And after a few calls and talking about equity, they actually had that ramp that you see there within the orange oval installed. So it was worth it. And I still love driving by to see that there and knowing that other children who are using wheelchairs for mobility have access. Next slide. And then just a couple of other things, as I shared with you, Julian didn't always share with me his trials and tribulations at school. And so he shared with me at the end of it was the end of third or fourth grade. He said, I went in to use the restroom because I happened to be in the building, and he had to like hammer down on the soap to actually get soap on his hands. And what an easy fix that would have been. So in his middle school, you can see there that all he had to do was put his hands under the soap water, and he had full access to a much easier soap dispenser. And then just getting in line for the cafeteria, he wants to be like everyone else. So he was always first in line and had the closest cafeteria table to where he actually went in and got his food. And that was just an opportunity for him to feel independent. It's also very important in elementary school. Next slide.
Okay, this is my son Spencer. He lives in Austin and is very independent. And in the essence of time, I'm going to let you go ahead and look at the slides on your own. I think they're going to be available online for you, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. You can see the services and accommodations he received in school. Next slide. And here are some more door openers, that kind of thing. Next slide. He also encountered some barriers to his education, and I think the biggest one was lack of knowledge and understanding of students with disabilities. So always be prepared to help educate teachers and administrators in terms of your child's needs. Next slide. Next slide. I do believe it was Spencer's inclusion with his regular developing peers all through school that enabled him to access school at a college level. Next slide. And it has allowed him to start his own business, which is disability oriented. Next slide. But it's important, I think, overall that we advocate and educate everyone in our communities to help them acknowledge and understand our children's needs as far as education is concerned. And Tina, we don't have much time, but we do have an important question that I think we need to address about the difference between 504 and an IEP. Do you want to address that real quick?
Sure, absolutely. So an IEP is based on the federal law. So by law, and I was thinking of this as Kimberly spoke earlier, she had mentioned continuous monitoring of a child's goals and objectives. And to me, as an educator, that is really the biggest difference. And I would say the real reason why we opted to choose the IEP and not the 504. We wanted to ensure that Julian's progress was consistently monitored by a case manager within the building. 504 is really just providing children, it's a law as well, but it's providing them accommodations to help them be successful in the classroom. I would say as an educator, it's not legally, those accommodations need to be met, but it's not quite as monitored as the IEP from a parent standpoint. I will tell you now, Julian, in high school, on paper he has an IEP, it's pretty much a 504. And that's what he'll travel with on into college, but we felt it was critical to have him monitored.
And I think if the school is denying eligibility for special education, the parent should go ahead and request an evaluation for special education. And the school has, once you've requested that evaluation, the school is legally obligated to give you the evaluation. So look at that. I hope we answered that question.
Well, I can tell you that Julian was eventually, I think I mentioned earlier, he was followed throughout the course of his day because we had a physical therapist who really felt that he shouldn't have an IEP, that he would be fine with a 504. And so we had the district representative come in and follow him throughout the day and felt that he needed certain things in place to be monitored to ensure access to the educational setting as everyone else had. So that was our avenue that seemed to make that difference.
Okay, our next question has to do with nursing care and if that should be included in an IEP. And if your child requires nursing care to stay in school, the school is obligated to provide that. You should have no expenses incurred in getting your child to school and educated at school. So it is not the family's responsibility to provide that care. It's the school's.
This is so great. Thank you so much. I wish we had so much more time for more questions today, but I think the time is up for today's session. Thank you so much to Tina and Kimberly for offering this amazing workshop today. We appreciate everyone who joined in. There is a survey linked in the session page, and you'll also be receiving a follow-up email with that survey link. So we welcome any feedback that you have. Once again, we are so incredibly thankful for the support of our sponsors for making the 2021 virtual SMA conference possible. Be sure to join us today for the virtual exhibit hall from 11:30 to 1:30. If there's any additional questions that you have, please feel free to contact us at familysupport@curesma.org. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for the 2021 virtual SMA conference.